The stagecoach lurched to a violent stop in front of the dusty trading post, and Preston Callahan knew his life was about to become considerably more complicated the moment he saw the woman step down onto the sun-baked earth of Hecla, Montana territory. It was the summer of 1883, and the heat shimmered off the packed dirt Main Street like water over stones. Preston had been loading supplies onto his horse, minding his own business, when the coach arrived 3 hours earlier than expected. He watched as the driver helped a young woman descend. Her dark blue traveling dress somehow still neat despite what must have been a grueling journey from back east. She had auburn hair pinned up beneath a modest bonnet, and even from 30 feet away, he could see the determined set of her jaw as she looked around the rough frontier town with wide green eyes, Preston's hands stilled on the rope he'd been tying. His younger brother Thomas had been talking for months about the mail-order bride he'd sent for, a woman from Philadelphia who'd agreed to marry a Montana rancher sight unseen. Thomas had shown Preston the letters, proud as a peacock, reading passages aloud about how refined and educated she was. Preston had listened with half an ear, more concerned with the practical matters of running their cattle operation than his brother's romantic notions. But Thomas wasn't here. He was back at the ranch, 20 miles outside of town, waiting for Preston to collect the supplies and return before nightfall. Thomas had wanted to come himself, had been champing at the bit all week, but their foreman had taken ill and someone needed to oversee the hands. Thomas had made Preston swear he'd explain to Miss Helena Porter that her intended would come calling first thing in the morning, properly dressed and prepared to make a good impression. Preston watched as Helena lifted a worn carpetbag and looked around uncertainly. She was younger than he'd expected, probably no more than 22 or 23. Her face had a delicate beauty to it, but there was something in her eyes that spoke of hardship, of decisions made out of necessity rather than whimsy. He knew that look. He'd seen it in the mirror often enough after their parents died and left him, at 25, responsible for his then 18-year-old brother and a struggling ranch. He should have walked over immediately, introduced himself, explained the situation. That would have been the right thing to do, the honorable thing. Instead, Preston found himself frozen in place, watching as Helena's gaze swept the street and landed on him. For a moment, their eyes met, and something passed between them that Preston couldn't name, something that made his chest tighten and his breath catch. Then a drunk stumbled out of the saloon behind her, and Preston was moving before he thought about it, crossing the street in long strides. The drunk was heading right for Helena, too far into his cups to watch where he was going. Preston caught the man by the shoulder and steered him away just as Helena took a startled step backward. "You all right, miss?" Preston asked, and immediately felt foolish. Of course she wasn't all right. She'd just arrived in a strange town, nearly been knocked over by a drunk, and was clearly waiting for someone who hadn't shown up. "I'm fine, thank you," Helena said, and her voice was clear and educated with just a hint of nervousness underneath. "I'm looking for Thomas Callahan. I was told he'd meet me here." Preston removed his hat, suddenly aware of how dusty and sweaty he must look after a morning of hard work. "I'm Preston Callahan, madam. Thomas is my brother. He got held up at the ranch, but he sent me to explain and to see you settled at the boarding house. He'll be here first thing tomorrow morning." He watched disappointment flicker across her face, followed quickly by something that might have been relief. "I see. Well, that's very kind of you, Mr. Callahan. I appreciate you coming to meet me." "It's no trouble," Preston said, though his tongue felt thick in his mouth. Up close, she was even lovelier than he'd first thought. There was intelligence in her eyes and a stubborn tilt to her chin that suggested she'd been through things that would have broken a weaker person. Let me get your trunk from the coach, and I'll walk you over to the boarding house. Mrs. Henley runs a respectable place, and she's expecting you." As Preston hefted Helena's small trunk onto his shoulder, his mind was racing. This was Thomas's intended bride. His brother had courted her through letters, had saved up money for a proper wedding, had talked of little else for months. Preston had no right to the feelings that were churning in his gut, no right to notice the graceful way Helena moved or the soft curve of her mouth. He was 3 years older than Thomas, old enough to know better than to let his head be turned by a pretty face and a pair of intelligent eyes. The walk to the boarding house was short, but Preston found himself wishing it was longer. Helena asked questions about the town, about the ranch, about what her life here would be like. He answered as best he could, trying to paint an honest picture without frightening her. "It's hard country," he said as they climbed the steps to the boarding house porch. "The winters are brutal and the summers can be just as bad in their own way, but there's a beauty to it too if you're willing to look. And the folks here are good people for the most part. They'll welcome you." "I'm not afraid of hard work," Helena said, and there was steel in her voice. "I've been working since I was old enough to hold a needle. My father died when I was 16, and my mother passed last winter. I've been supporting myself as a seamstress, but the work is scarce and the pay is worse. When I saw Thomas's advertisement, it seemed like Providence was offering me a chance at something better." Preston set her trunk down and knocked on the door. He wanted to ask her more, wanted to know everything about her, but he had no right. Instead, he said, "Thomas is a good man. He'll treat you well." The door opened and Mrs. Henley appeared, a plump woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner. "Ah, you must be Miss Porter. Come in, come in. I've got your room all ready. Preston, thank you for bringing her by. You tell that brother of yours I expect him here bright and early tomorrow, understand?" "Yes, madam," Preston said. He tipped his hat to Helena. "It was a pleasure meeting you, Miss Porter. I hope you'll be very happy here." Helena's green eyes held his for a moment longer than was strictly proper. "Thank you, Mr. Callahan. I hope so too." Preston made himself turn and walk away, but he could feel her gaze on his back until he turned the corner. He collected his horse and the supplies, working mechanically while his mind spun in circles. This was wrong. Everything about what he was feeling was wrong. Thomas had seen her first, had written to her, had won her agreement to come all this way. The fact that Preston had been the one to physically lay eyes on her first was just an accident of timing, nothing more. The ride back to the ranch was long and hot, giving Preston far too much time to think. He tried to focus on practical matters, on the list of things that needed to be done before winter, on the new breeding stock they wanted to acquire. But his mind kept drifting back to Helena, to the way her eyes had lit up when she smiled, to the quiet strength in her voice when she talked about supporting herself. By the time he reached the ranch, the sun was sinking toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Thomas was waiting on the porch, practically bouncing with nervous energy. "Well," Thomas demanded before Preston had even dismounted. "Did you meet her? What's she like? Is she as pretty as her photograph?" Preston swung down from his horse, taking his time tying the reins to the hitching post. Thomas was tall and lean, with the same dark hair and blue eyes as Preston, but where Preston's face had been weathered by sun and worry, Thomas's still held an optimistic softness. He was 23, 7 years younger than Preston, and sometimes the gap felt like a lifetime. "She's fine," Preston said, his voice carefully neutral. "Arrived safe and sound. I got her settled at the boarding house like you asked. She's expecting you tomorrow morning." "But what's she like?" Thomas pressed. "Did you talk to her? What did she say?" Preston pulled the supply bags off his horse. using the activity as an excuse not to meet his brother's eyes. She seems nice enough, educated, well-spoken. She asked questions about the ranch and the town. He hesitated, then added, "She told me her parents are both dead. She's been on her own for a while, working as a seamstress." Thomas's face softened. "I know. She told me in her letters it must have been hard for her being alone like that, but she won't be alone anymore. I'm going to take such good care of her, Preston. I'm going to make her so happy." The simple, earnest declaration hit Preston like a punch to the gut. Thomas meant every word. His brother had a good heart, always had. He was kind and optimistic and saw the best in everyone. He deserved happiness, deserved a wife who would love him without reservation. And Preston was going to make damn sure Thomas got exactly that. That night, Preston lay awake in his bed, staring at the ceiling and making plans. He would stay away from Helena as much as possible. He would encourage Thomas, help him court her properly, do everything in his power to ensure the marriage went forward smoothly. What Preston felt didn't matter. It was just attraction, just loneliness playing tricks on him. He'd buried himself in work for so long that he'd forgotten what it was like to feel anything for a woman. That was all this was. It would pass. It had to pass. The next morning, Preston helped Thomas get ready, biting his tongue as his brother changed shirts 3 times and fussed with his hair like a schoolboy. Thomas had shaved so close his face was red, and he'd put on his Sunday best despite the fact that it was only Tuesday. "How do I look?" Thomas asked for the 3rd time. "You look fine," Preston said. "Now get going before you're late, and Thomas, be yourself. She agreed to come all this way to marry you. She must see something worth having in your letters." Thomas grinned, some of his nervousness fading. "Thanks, Preston. I don't know what I'd do without you." After Thomas left, Preston threw himself into work with a vengeance. He spent the morning repairing fence line, working until his muscles ached and sweat soaked through his shirt. But no amount of physical labor could stop him from wondering how Thomas's meeting with Helena was going, from imagining them sitting together in the boarding house parlor, getting to know each other. Thomas didn't return until late afternoon, and when he did, his face was flushed with happiness. "She's wonderful, Preston. Even better than I'd hoped. We talked for hours. She's funny and smart, and she didn't even flinch when I told her about some of the rougher aspects of ranch life. We're going to be married next Saturday. Mrs. Henley is helping her with the arrangements." "That's real fast," Preston said carefully. "I know, but why wait? She came all this way to marry me, and I've been waiting months already. Besides, it's not proper for her to be staying at the boarding house indefinitely when everyone knows she's here to be my wife." Thomas's grin was infectious. "Say you'll stand up with me, Preston. I need my brother there." Preston forced a smile. "Of course I will. I'm happy for you, Thomas." And he told himself firmly. He was happy for his brother. The sick feeling in his stomach was just indigestion from the beans he'd had for lunch. The next week passed in a blur of wedding preparations. Thomas was in town almost every day, courting Helena properly despite their impending marriage. Preston stayed at the ranch, finding excuses to remain busy whenever Thomas suggested he come along. It wasn't hard to do. The ranch always needed work, and Preston had gotten good at burying himself in it. But 2 days before the wedding, Thomas came back from town with a worried expression that immediately put Preston on alert. "What's wrong?" Preston asked. "It's Jake Palmer," Thomas said. Jake was their foreman, the man who'd been ill the day Helena arrived. "Doc says it's pneumonia. He's getting worse, not better. Doc wants to keep him in town for observation, maybe send him to Helena." He meant the city in Montana, not the woman, "if he doesn't improve." Preston swore under his breath. Jake had been with them for 5 years, was more friend than employee at this point. "How bad is it?" Bad enough. Doc says the next few days will tell. Thomas ran a hand through his hair. Preston, I hate to ask this, but we need someone to oversee the men. The fall roundup is coming, and we've got that new herd to integrate and a dozen other things that can't wait. Jake usually handles all that, but with him sick. You need me to take over his duties, Preston finished. It wasn't a question. Just for a while, Thomas said quickly. Just until Jake is back on his feet or we can hire someone else. I know it's a lot to ask, especially right now with the wedding, but I don't know who else can do it. You know this ranch better than anyone and the men respect you. Preston nodded slowly. It made sense. Thomas had always been more interested in the business side of ranching than the day-to-day operations. He was good with numbers, with planning and long-term strategy, while Preston was the one who knew cattle and land and how to manage men. They'd fallen into their respective roles naturally after their father died, and it had worked well for them. But it also meant that Preston would be even busier than usual, would have even less time to think about things he shouldn't be thinking about. Maybe that was for the best. I'll do it, Preston said. Don't worry about the ranch, just focus on your wedding and on Helena. Thomas's relief was palpable. Thank you. I mean it, Preston. I know I don't say it enough, but I couldn't do any of this without you. The wedding day arrived with perfect weather, clear and warm with just enough breeze to keep the heat manageable. The ceremony was to be held in the small church on the edge of town, with a reception afterward at the boarding house. Preston dressed in his best suit, a dark gray affair that he hadn't worn since their father's funeral, and tried not to feel like he was attending a similar event now. He arrived at the church early and took his place at the front beside Thomas, who was practically vibrating with nervous energy. The church filled slowly with townspeople and ranch hands, everyone curious to see the mail-order bride who'd captured young Thomas Callahan's heart. Preston kept his eyes on the altar, not trusting himself to look toward the door. Then the piano began to play, and Preston had no choice. He turned with everyone else to watch Helena walk down the aisle. She was beautiful. Someone, probably Mrs. Henley, had helped her fix up an old white dress, adding lace and ribbons until it looked almost new. Her auburn hair was partially up, with long curls falling past her shoulders, and she carried a small bouquet of wildflowers. But it was her face that caught Preston's attention. She looked nervous but determined, her green eyes fixed on Thomas with what Preston desperately hoped was genuine affection. As she drew closer, her gaze flickered to Preston for just a moment. Something passed between them again, that same inexplicable connection he'd felt when she first arrived. Then she was looking back at Thomas, and Preston told himself he'd imagined it. The ceremony was brief. The minister spoke about the sacred bonds of matrimony, about love and honor and cherishing one another. Thomas repeated his vows in a clear, strong voice, his face shining with happiness. Helena's voice was softer but no less steady as she promised to love and honor Thomas, to be his wife in sickness and in health, until death parted them. Preston handed over the ring when prompted, a simple gold band that had belonged to their mother. He watched Thomas slip it onto Helena's finger, saw her small smile as she looked down at it. Then the minister was pronouncing them husband and wife, and Thomas was kissing his bride, and it was done. Helena was no longer Miss Porter from Philadelphia. She was Mrs. Thomas Callahan, and Preston had no right to feel like something vital had just been torn from his chest. The reception was a lively affair, with music and dancing and more food than Preston had seen in months. The townspeople had turned out in force, bringing dishes and well wishes. Preston stood to the side, nursing a glass of whiskey and watching Thomas spin Helena around the makeshift dance floor in the boarding house parlor. She was laughing, her face flushed and happy, and Thomas looked like he'd been handed the keys to paradise. They made a handsome couple, Preston thought. They looked right together, her dark red hair contrasting with Thomas's darker coloring, her petite frame fitting neatly against his lean height. "You're brooding," a voice said beside him, and Preston turned to find Mrs. Henley watching him with shrewd eyes. "Just thinking," Preston said. Mrs. Henley said, a wealth of meaning in that single sound. "Your brother is a lucky man. She's a good girl, that Helena. Smart as a whip and not afraid to speak her mind. She'll be good for him." "I'm sure she will," Preston said. Mrs. Henley studied him for a moment longer, then patted his arm. "Your time will come, Preston Callahan. The right woman is out there somewhere." Preston wanted to laugh at the irony, but managed to keep a straight face. "Yes, madam." As the afternoon stretched into evening, Preston found himself cornered into a dance with the bride. It was tradition, after all, for the best man to dance with the new wife. Thomas practically pushed them together, grinning like a fool, before spinning off to dance with Mrs. Henley. Preston took Helena's hand, carefully maintaining a respectful distance as they began to move. She felt small and delicate in his arms, but he could feel the strength in her too, the resilience that had brought her across half a country to start a new life. "Thank you for everything you did to help with the wedding," Helena said. Her voice was slightly breathless from the previous dances. "Thomas told me you took over Jake's responsibilities so he could spend time in town with me. That was very kind." "It's nothing," Preston said. "Thomas is my brother. I want him to be happy." "He talks about you constantly," Helena said. "He admires you very much. He says you practically raised him after your parents died, that you saved the ranch when everyone said it was a lost cause." Preston felt uncomfortable with the praise. "Thomas does his share. He's good at the things I'm not." They danced in silence for a moment, and Preston tried to ignore the way Helena's hand felt in his, tried not to notice the scent of lavender that clung to her hair. Then she said, quietly enough that no one else could hear, "Can I ask you something honestly?" "Of course." "That first day when you met me at the stagecoach, did you? I felt—" She trailed off, then shook her head. "Never mind, I'm being foolish. It's just wedding day nerves." But Preston knew what she'd been about to say because he'd felt it too, that instant connection, that sense of recognition. He should have reassured her, should have dismissed it as nothing. Instead, he said, "I felt it too." Helena's green eyes widened, meeting his for a heartbeat too long. Then the music ended, and Thomas was there, claiming his wife with a possessive arm around her waist. Preston stepped back, bowing slightly, and made his escape as soon as was polite. He left the reception early, citing ranch responsibilities, and rode home through the gathering darkness. The prairie stretched out around him, vast and empty, and Preston felt a kinship with it. This was his life now, would always be his life. He'd work the ranch, support his brother, and eventually die alone, probably trampled by a steer or frozen in a winter storm. It was the life he'd chosen when their parents died, and he'd made his peace with it long ago. Or at least he thought he had, until Helena Porter stepped off that stagecoach and turned his world upside down. The next weeks were a special kind of torture. Thomas and Helena moved into the ranch house, taking over the larger bedroom that had once belonged to Preston's parents. Preston moved his things to the smaller room at the other end of the hall, as far away as he could get while still living in the same house. He buried himself in work, often leaving before dawn and not returning until well after dark. Helena threw herself into making the house a home. She cleaned and organized, planted a small garden, learned to cook the simple, hearty meals that ranch life demanded. She was cheerful and hardworking, never complaining about the primitive conditions or the isolation. The ranch hands adored her, and she quickly became a favorite in town when she began taking in sewing work to earn extra money. Preston watched it all from a distance, and hated himself for the way his heart leaped every time he saw her, for the way his eyes sought her out in any room. He was always scrupulously polite, always careful never to be alone with her, but he couldn't stop himself from noticing everything about her. The way she hummed while she worked, the fierce concentration on her face when she was sewing, the gentle way she doctored the ranch hands when they got injured, showing no squeamishness at blood or dirt. Thomas seemed obliviously happy, talking constantly about his good fortune, about how lucky he was to have found such a perfect wife. Preston agreed with everything his brother said and felt like a fraud every time. It was 6 weeks after the wedding when everything changed. Preston had taken a crew out to the far pasture to move cattle, planning to be gone for 3 days. But on the second day, his horse stepped in a hole and threw him, and Preston landed hard enough to crack a rib. The pain was immediate and sharp, making it difficult to breathe. The men wanted to take him to the doctor in town, but Preston refused, insisting they finish the job first. By the time they made it back to the ranch house late the following evening, Preston was running a fever and could barely stay in the saddle. Thomas was in town on business, not expected back until the next day. That left Helena to help Preston into the house, her face pale with worry as she saw the way he was moving. "You're hurt," she said, and there was no question in her voice, only certainty. "Just a cracked rib," Preston said through gritted teeth. "I'll be fine by morning. Don't be ridiculous. You're burning up with fever. Come on, let's get you to bed, and then I'm going to examine that rib properly." Preston wanted to argue, but he hurt too much and felt too awful to put up much of a fight. He let Helena guide him to his room, let her help him out of his dusty, sweat-stained shirt. Her hands were gentle but thorough as she examined his ribs, and Preston had to close his eyes against the feel of her touching him, even though he knew it was purely medical. "It's definitely cracked," she said, "and you've bruised the muscle badly. I need to wrap it, and you need to stay in bed for at least a few days." "No arguments," she added when Preston opened his mouth to protest. "If you don't rest, you could puncture a lung, and then we'd be dealing with something much more serious." She disappeared and returned with strips of clean cloth, which she used to bind his ribs tightly. The pressure helped with the pain, and Preston found himself relaxing slightly despite the awkwardness of the situation. "Where did you learn to do this?" he asked. "My father was a doctor before he died," Helena said. "He taught me quite a bit. I used to help him in his practice when I was younger." She finished tying off the bandage and stood back, studying him critically. "Now, let's see about that fever. When did you start feeling poorly?" "This morning," Preston admitted, "but it's just from lying on the cold ground last night. It's nothing serious." Helena's expression was skeptical, but she didn't argue. She brought him water and made him drink it all, then fetched cool cloths to put on his forehead. Despite his protests, she sat with him through the evening, changing the cloths regularly and making sure he drank water whenever he woke. Preston drifted in and out of feverish sleep, always aware of Helena's presence nearby. At some point deep in the night, he woke to find her sitting in the chair beside his bed, her head tilted back and her eyes closed. She'd fallen asleep while watching over him. In the lamp light, she looked younger, softer, and Preston let himself study her face without the usual guilt. She was beautiful, yes, but it was more than that. There was a goodness in her that shone through in everything she did, a kind of gentle strength that Preston found irresistible. She'd been thrust into a difficult situation, married to a man she barely knew, living in harsh and unfamiliar conditions, and she'd faced it all with grace and determination. She deserved so much better than a dusty cattle ranch in the middle of nowhere. She deserved the world. And Thomas would give it to her, Preston told himself firmly. His brother was a good man. He'd make Helena happy. Preston needed to let go of this foolish infatuation before it destroyed them all. But even as he thought it, Helena stirred in her chair and her eyes opened. For a moment she looked disoriented, then her gaze focused on Preston and something softened in her face. "How are you feeling?" she asked quietly. "Better," Preston said, and it was true. The fever had broken, leaving him weak but clear-headed. "You should go to bed. You don't need to sit up with me." "I wanted to," Helena said simply. Then, after a pause, "Preston, can I ask you something? And will you answer me honestly?" Every instinct Preston had was screaming at him to deflect, to change the subject, but he was too tired and too weak to keep up his guard. "All right. That day at the stagecoach when we first met, if I hadn't been promised to Thomas, would you have courted me yourself?" The question hung in the air between them, dangerous and impossible to answer safely. Preston knew he should lie, should laugh it off or pretend he didn't understand what she was asking. But he'd promised to be honest, and something in Helena's eyes told him she deserved the truth, even if it complicated everything. "Yes," he said simply. "God help me, yes I would have." Helena drew in a sharp breath, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. Then she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I thought so. I felt it too that day. And I've felt it every day since, even though I have no right to, even though I'm married to your brother and I meant every vow I spoke." "Helena," Preston said, and his voice was rough with emotion he couldn't quite suppress. "We can't. Thomas is a good man. He loves you. He deserves better than this from both of us." "I know," Helena said, and there were tears in her eyes now. "I do care for Thomas, truly I do. He's kind and good, and I'm grateful for everything he's given me. But what I feel for you, Preston, it's different. It's like lightning struck me that first day, and I've been trying to ignore it ever since, but I can't. I can't stop thinking about you, can't stop wishing things were different." Preston closed his eyes, fighting against everything he wanted to say, everything he wanted to do. "They're not different. You're Thomas's wife. That's the reality we have to live with. Whatever might have been, whatever we might have felt, it doesn't matter now. We have to let it go." "You're right," Helena said, but she didn't sound convinced. "Of course you're right." She stood up, wrapping her arms around herself. "I should go. Thomas will be home in the morning, and he can't know about any of this. It would break his heart." "Helena, wait," Preston said, and she paused at the door. "For what it's worth, if things were different, if I'd met you first, I would have done everything in my power to make you happy. I want you to know that." Helena's smile was sad and sweet. "I know. And for what it's worth, I think I could have loved you, Preston Callahan. Maybe I already do." Then she slipped out of the room before Preston could respond, leaving him alone with his thoughts and his guilt. The next morning, Thomas returned from town full of energy and good spirits, carrying news of good prices for cattle and new contracts he'd secured. He was horrified to hear about Preston's injury, and immediately tried to take over all of his brother's responsibilities, though Preston protested weakly that he'd be fine in a day or two. Helena acted perfectly normal, tending to Preston's injury with professional efficiency, and showing no sign of the conversation they'd had the night before. But Preston could feel the tension between them, could see the way she carefully avoided his eyes, and he knew that nothing would ever be quite the same again. Over the next few weeks, as Preston healed and returned to work, he and Helena fell into an unspoken agreement. They were never alone together if they could help it. When they had to interact, they were polite and distant, like strangers sharing a house. It should have made things easier, but somehow it only made Preston more aware of her, made him notice every time she laughed at something Thomas said, every time she touched his brother's arm in passing. Thomas, oblivious to the undercurrents, continued to be deliriously happy with his marriage. He talked about the future constantly, about the children he and Helena would have, about growing the ranch and building a legacy. Preston listened and agreed and felt his heart break a little more each day. The breaking point came in late October as the ranch hands were preparing for the fall roundup. Preston was in the barn, checking tack and supplies when Helena appeared in the doorway. She was wearing her riding clothes, her hair tied back in a practical braid. "Thomas is having me ride out with you all tomorrow," she said without preamble. "He thinks I should see how a roundup works, learn more about the actual operation of the ranch. He didn't ask me, just announced it at breakfast like it was already decided." Preston felt his stomach drop. 3 days in close quarters with Helena, sleeping under the stars with only a thin bedroll between him and temptation, was a recipe for disaster. "You don't have to go if you don't want to," he said carefully. "Roundup is hard, dirty work. It's not exactly pleasant." "I don't think Thomas would take no for an answer," Helena said. "And besides, he's right that I should learn more about the ranch. If something happened to either of you, I'd need to know how to run things." She paused, then added quietly, "Unless you'd rather I didn't go." "If you don't want me there, I'll find an excuse." Preston should have told her to stay home. Should have insisted that it wasn't appropriate, that the men wouldn't be comfortable with a woman present, that it was too dangerous. But he was tired of fighting what he felt, tired of pretending that his life was fine when every day felt like walking through fire. "Come if you want," he said. "Just be ready for long hours and rough conditions." The roundup crew left at dawn the next morning, a dozen men plus Thomas, Preston, and Helena. They rode out to the far reaches of the ranch, where the cattle had scattered during the summer grazing season, and began the slow process of gathering them back together. It was hard, exhausting work, requiring skill and endurance and a good horse. Helena surprised everyone by keeping up without complaint. She wasn't as skilled a rider as the men, but she was fearless and determined, throwing herself into the work with the same intensity she brought to everything else. By the end of the first day, she'd earned the respect of the hands, who began treating her like one of the crew rather than the boss's delicate city bride. Thomas was proud of her, praising her efforts and bragging to anyone who would listen about his remarkable wife. Preston watched from a distance, fighting the jealousy that burned in his chest. This should have been enough to kill whatever feelings he had for Helena. Seeing her with Thomas, seeing how well they worked together, should have reminded Preston that she was taken, that she'd made her choice. Instead, it only made him want her more. On the second night, after a long day of hard riding, the crew made camp in a small canyon that provided shelter from the wind. A fire was built, dinner was cooked and eaten, and slowly the men began settling down for the night. Preston took the first watch, volunteering to ride the perimeter and keep an eye on the cattle. It was a legitimate job, but it also gave him an excuse to get away from the camp, away from the sight of Thomas and Helena sitting close together by the fire. He'd been riding for about an hour when he heard hoofbeats behind him. He turned, expecting one of the hands coming to relieve him early, and found Helena instead. "What are you doing out here?" Preston asked, unable to keep the edge out of his voice. "It's not safe to ride alone at night." "I could see you from camp," Helena said. "And I needed to talk to you. Thomas is asleep. He won't know I left." "You shouldn't be here," Preston said, but he didn't ride away. Helena brought her horse alongside his, and they stood there in the darkness, the only sounds the distant lowing of cattle and the whisper of wind through the grass. Above them, the stars were so thick and bright, they seemed to press down on the earth. "I can't keep doing this," Helena said finally. "I can't keep pretending that nothing happened between us, that there's nothing here. It's eating me alive, Preston." "Nothing did happen between us," Preston said firmly. You're married to Thomas, that's all that matters. Is it? Helena's voice was fierce now, with an edge of desperation. Preston, I've tried so hard to be a good wife to him. I cook and clean and never complain. I listen to his plans and support his dreams. I share his bed. Her voice broke on the last words. But when he touches me, I close my eyes and imagine it's you. When he talks about our future, I wonder what it would have been like if you'd been the one to meet me at that stagecoach. Is that being a good wife? Because it doesn't feel like it. Preston felt like his chest was being crushed. What do you want me to say, Helena? That I feel the same way? That every day is torture watching you with him, knowing that you're his and not mine? Would that make any of this better? At least it would be honest, Helena said. At least we'd stop lying to ourselves. And then what? Preston demanded. We declare our feelings and then what, Helena? You're married. That's a sacred bond, one that can't be broken just because we wish things were different. I won't do that to Thomas. I won't betray my brother like that, no matter what I feel. I know, Helena whispered. God help me. I know you're right. But Preston, I have to live the rest of my life knowing that I married the wrong brother. That I could have had something real, something true, if only the stagecoach had arrived a few hours later, if only Thomas had been the one to meet me instead of you. The pain in her voice was too much. Preston found himself dismounting, found Helena doing the same, and then they were standing inches apart in the darkness. He could see tears on her face, could feel the trembling in her body, and his resolve finally shattered. This is wrong, he said, even as he reached up to cup her face in his hands. This is so wrong. I know, Helena said, and then she was kissing him, and Preston was kissing her back, and nothing in his life had ever felt so right and so wrong at the same time. It was a desperate kiss, full of longing and frustration and grief for what could never be. Preston pulled Helena against him, feeling her warmth, her softness, the way she fit perfectly in his arms just like he'd known she would. Her hands fisted in his shirt, and she made a small sound that went straight through him. Then Preston heard a sound, the crunch of gravel under hooves, and they broke apart just as one of the ranch hands rode around the bend. The man, a young fellow named Pete, pulled up short, his face flushing as he realized what he'd interrupted. Sorry, boss, Pete said, not meeting Preston's eyes. Just coming to relieve you on watch like you asked earlier. Right, Preston said, his voice rough. Thanks, Pete. Helena was just helping me check on a cow I thought might be injured, but it turned out to be nothing. It was a thin excuse, and from Pete's expression, he didn't believe it for a second. But he nodded anyway, loyal to the family that employed him. Yes, sir. You and the missus better get back to camp. It's getting cold out here. The ride back to camp was silent and miserable. Preston's mind was racing, trying to figure out how to fix this, how to undo what had just happened. But he couldn't undo it. He couldn't unfeel Helena's lips on his, couldn't forget the way she'd trembled in his arms. At the edge of camp, Helena stopped her horse. Preston, she said quietly. What are we going to do? Nothing, Preston said, and his voice was hard now, harder than he'd ever used with her. We're going to do nothing. We're going to forget this happened. You're going to be a good wife to Thomas, and I'm going to be a good brother, and we're never going to speak of this again. Do you understand? But Pete saw us, Helena said, fear creeping into her voice. What if he tells someone? What if Thomas finds out? Pete won't say anything, Preston said, though he wasn't entirely sure. He's a good man. But Helena, this can never happen again. Never. I don't care how we feel or what we want. Thomas is my brother and you're his wife. That's the end of it. Helena looked like she wanted to argue, but finally she just nodded. You're right. I'm sorry, Preston. I'm so sorry. She rode back into camp, heading to the bedroll she shared with Thomas. Preston stayed outside the circle of firelight, his mind churning. This was a disaster. He'd crossed a line he could never uncross, had betrayed his brother in the worst possible way. The fact that Thomas didn't know didn't make it any better. If anything, it made it worse. The rest of the roundup passed in tense silence. Preston threw himself into the work with a vengeance, pushing the men and himself harder than necessary. Helena stayed close to Thomas, playing the part of the devoted wife so well that Preston almost believed it himself. But he could feel her watching him when she thought no one was looking, could sense the weight of unspoken words between them. When they finally returned to the ranch, Preston made a decision. He couldn't keep living like this, couldn't keep torturing himself and Helena by proximity. The ranch was doing well enough now that they could afford to expand, to maybe open a second operation. He would propose it to Thomas, would volunteer to run the new spread, would put enough distance between himself and Helena that they could both move on with their lives. But before he could bring it up, Thomas made an announcement at dinner that changed everything. "Helena and I have some news," Thomas said, his face glowing with pride. "We're going to have a baby. Helena's expecting, probably due in the spring." Preston felt the world tilt. He forced himself to smile, to offer congratulations, to say all the right things. But inside, he felt like he was dying. A baby. Helena was carrying Thomas's child. There could be no clearer sign that she was his brother's wife, no more permanent bond between them. And yet, even knowing that, even understanding that this sealed Helena's fate irrevocably, Preston couldn't stop the small, traitorous voice in the back of his mind that wished things were different. Over the next months, as Helena's pregnancy progressed, Preston watched his brother transform into an even more devoted husband. Thomas was constantly fussing over Helena, making sure she didn't overwork herself, planning for their child's future. He talked about building an addition to the house, about hiring help so Helena wouldn't have to do so much, about everything they'd need for the baby. Preston helped with it all, because that was what brothers did. He built the cradle, helped frame out the new room, did all the things an uncle should do. And he kept his distance from Helena as much as possible, speaking to her only when necessary, never allowing himself to be alone with her. The incident with Pete had, mercifully, not resulted in gossip. The young man had kept his mouth shut, though Preston sometimes caught him looking between Preston and Helena with a troubled expression. Preston made a note to give Pete a raise and more responsibility. Loyalty like that was worth its weight in gold. Winter came, harsh and cold, locking them all in the house together. It was a special kind of torture, being in such close quarters with Helena, seeing her every day as her belly swelled with Thomas's child. She seemed to bloom with pregnancy, becoming even more beautiful, and Thomas was so happy he practically glowed. It snowed heavily in January, trapping them inside for days at a time. Preston spent most of his time in the barn or his room, avoiding the domestic scenes in the main part of the house. But one evening, he came inside from checking on the horses to find Helena alone in the kitchen, Thomas having gone to bed early with a headache. She was standing at the window, one hand on her swollen belly, staring out at the falling snow. She looked so beautiful and so sad that Preston's heart ached. "You should be resting," he said, announcing his presence. Helena turned and he could see she'd been crying. "I can't sleep. The baby is very active tonight." Preston knew he should leave, should retreat to his room and pretend this moment wasn't happening. Instead, he found himself walking over to stand beside her. "Are you all right? Is something wrong?" "No, everything is fine," Helena said, but her voice was thick with unshed tears. "The baby is healthy. Thomas is happy. I have everything I could possibly want." "But," Preston prompted gently. "But I'm miserable," Helena whispered. "I'm carrying my husband's child and I'm miserable because I'm in love with his brother. What kind of person does that make me?" "Helena, don't," Preston said, but his voice had no strength behind it. "I have to say it, Preston. Just this once I have to be honest. I love you. I've loved you since that first moment at the stagecoach, and pregnancy has only made it worse. Every time Thomas touches me, I wish it was you. Every time he talks about our future, I imagine what it would be like if we were building that future together instead. I know it's wrong. I know I'm a terrible wife and a terrible person for feeling this way, but I can't stop." Preston closed his eyes, fighting against everything he wanted to do, everything he wanted to say. When he opened them again, Helena was watching him with desperate hope in her eyes. "I love you too," Preston said, and saw Helena's breath catch. "I've loved you from the moment I saw you step off that stagecoach. But Helena, it doesn't matter. You're married to Thomas. You're carrying his child. We can't do anything about the way we feel. All we can do is bear it and try to be good people despite it." "Is that enough for you?" Helena asked. "Is that really going to be enough for the rest of your life?" "It has to be," Preston said. "Because the alternative is betraying Thomas, and I won't do that. He's my brother. He's a good man who loves you and deserves your loyalty. I won't be the one to break his heart, no matter what it costs me." Helena was fully crying now, tears streaming down her face. "I wish I'd never gotten on that stagecoach. I wish I'd stayed in Philadelphia and died poor and alone, because at least then I wouldn't have to live every day knowing what I can't have." Preston did the hardest thing he'd ever done in his life. He stepped away from her, putting physical distance between them to match the emotional distance he was trying to maintain. "You don't mean that. You'll have a child soon, a baby to love and care for. That will help. It has to help." "Will it?" Helena asked. "Or will I just look at my child and see Thomas's eyes instead of yours?" Preston had no answer for that. He left the kitchen without another word, retreating to his room where he could be alone with his guilt and his longing. That night, he made a firm decision. As soon as the weather cleared and the baby was born, he would leave. He'd find a way to buy his own land, start his own ranch, put distance between himself and Helena that would make it impossible for them to keep torturing each other like this. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. Helena went into labor on a bitter cold night in March. Thomas was in a panic, sending one of the hands racing to town for the doctor while he hovered uselessly, wringing his hands. Preston tried to stay out of the way, but Helena's labor was difficult, lasting through the night and into the next day. The doctor arrived around noon, taking over the bedroom with a grim expression. Hours passed with agonizing slowness. Preston could hear Helena's cries of pain through the walls, could see the fear in Thomas's face as the doctor's expression grew increasingly worried. Finally, as the sun was setting on the second day of labor, Preston heard the thin, reedy cry of a newborn baby. Thomas rushed into the room and Preston waited in the hallway, his heart pounding. Minutes passed like hours and then the door opened. The doctor came out and his face was grave. "The baby is healthy, a boy," the doctor said, "but Mrs. Callahan lost a great deal of blood. She's very weak. The next few days will tell whether she pulls through." Preston felt the floor drop out from under him. "How bad is it?" "Bad," the doctor said bluntly. "I've done everything I can, but her body has been through tremendous trauma. She needs rest and she needs to fight. The rest is up to her and God." Thomas emerged from the bedroom then, his face pale and his eyes red from crying. In his arms was a tiny bundle wrapped in blankets. "She wants to see you," he said to Preston, and his voice was hoarse. "She asked for you specifically." Preston's heart lurched. "Thomas, I shouldn't. You should be with her." "She asked for you," Thomas repeated. "Please, Preston, I don't know why it's important to her, but it is. Go sit with her while I take care of the baby." Preston entered the bedroom feeling like he was walking to his own execution. Helena was lying in the bed, so pale she almost seemed translucent. Her hair was damp with sweat, and there were dark circles under her eyes. But when she saw Preston, she smiled weakly. "You came," she whispered. Preston pulled a chair up beside the bed, taking her hand without thinking. "Of course I came. How are you feeling?" "Tired," Helena said. "So tired, Preston. The doctor doesn't think I'm going to make it. I can see it in his face." "Don't say that," Preston said fiercely. "You're strong. You're going to pull through this." "Maybe," Helena said. "But if I don't, I need you to know something. I need you to promise me something." "Anything," Preston said, and he meant it. "If I die, I need you to help Thomas raise the baby. Promise me you'll stay, that you won't leave like I know you've been planning. Thomas will need you and my son will need you." Preston felt tears burning in his eyes. "Helena, you're not going to die. Promise me," Helena insisted, her grip on his hand surprisingly strong. "Promise me, Preston." "I promise," Preston said, "but you're going to be fine. You have to be fine." Helena's eyes were already drifting closed. "I love you," she whispered. "I'm sorry it couldn't be different, but I love you." "I love you too," Preston said, not caring anymore who might hear. "So you have to fight, Helena. You have to stay." But Helena was already asleep, her breathing shallow and rapid. Preston sat with her for a long time, holding her hand and willing her to live with every fiber of his being. Eventually, Thomas came back in, and Preston reluctantly gave up his place beside the bed. The next 3 days were the longest of Preston's life. Helena drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes lucid and sometimes delirious with fever. Thomas barely left her side, and Preston helped care for the baby, a small but healthy boy that Thomas had named Peter after their father. On the 4th day, Helena's fever broke. She woke up clear-headed for the first time since the birth, asking for water and for her baby. The doctor examined her and pronounced that she'd turned the corner, that with rest and care, she would likely make a full recovery. The relief was overwhelming. Thomas wept openly, thanking God and the doctor and everyone else he could think of. Preston retreated to the barn, where he could be alone with the storm of emotions raging through him. Helena was going to live. She was going to raise her son with Thomas, was going to continue being his brother's wife, and Preston was going to have to watch it all and pretend his heart wasn't breaking. But he'd promised. He'd promised to stay, to help raise Peter, to be there for Thomas and Helena both. And Preston Callahan had never broken a promise in his life. The months that followed Helena's recovery were strange and strained. Preston kept his promise, staying at the ranch and helping with the baby. Little Peter was a healthy, happy child who looked like a perfect blend of Thomas and Helena. Preston loved him instantly and completely, grateful for something uncomplicated to pour his affection into. Helena slowly regained her strength, but the difficult birth had changed her. She was quieter, more withdrawn. She cared for Peter with devoted intensity, but Preston noticed that she seemed distant with Thomas, allowing his affection but rarely initiating it herself. Thomas, preoccupied with the baby and with running the ranch, didn't seem to notice, or perhaps chose not to. Preston and Helena fell into a careful dance of avoidance and painful politeness. They spoke when necessary, were cordial and respectful, and never, ever allowed themselves to be alone together. It should have been enough. It should have made things bearable. But Preston felt like he was slowly suffocating. Every day in the house was a reminder of what he couldn't have. Every moment watching Helena with Peter was a knife to the heart. He loved his nephew desperately, but he also resented the baby for being one more tie that bound Helena irrevocably to Thomas. It was late summer, nearly a year after Helena had first arrived in Hecla, when the situation finally came to a head. Thomas had taken Peter to town to show him off to the townspeople, leaving Preston and Helena alone at the ranch for the first time in months. Preston was in the workshop, repairing a broken saddle, when Helena appeared in the doorway. She looked tired and thin, wearing a simple work dress and an expression of determination. "We need to talk," she said without preamble. Preston set down his tools, his heart sinking. "I don't think that's a good idea." "I don't care," Helena said, stepping into the workshop and closing the door behind her. "Preston, this can't continue. The way we're living, dancing around each other, pretending everything is fine when it's not. It's killing me, and I think it's killing you too. What do you want me to say?" Preston asked wearily. "Nothing has changed, Helena. You're still married to Thomas. You have a child together. The situation is what it is." "I know that," Helena said. "Believe me, I know, but Preston, I think we need to acknowledge the truth, at least to each other. We love each other." "That's not going to change. But we also both love Thomas in our own ways, and we both love Peter. We would never do anything to hurt them." "So what are you suggesting?" Preston asked. Helena took a deep breath. "I'm suggesting that we accept the reality of the situation. I'm Thomas's wife. I will never betray him physically, and neither will you. But I think we need to stop pretending that there's nothing between us. I think we need to let ourselves at least be friends, let ourselves care about each other openly, within the bounds of what's appropriate. Because right now, this distance we're maintaining, it's not protecting Thomas. It's just making all three of us miserable." Preston studied her for a long moment. "You want to be friends, after everything?" "I want to stop feeling like I'm drowning," Helena said simply. "I want to be able to talk to you, to rely on you, to have you in Peter's life without all this guilt and pain. I want to find a way to live with this situation that doesn't make me want to die." The honesty in her voice broke something in Preston. He'd been trying so hard to do the right thing to protect everyone, but Helena was right. The distance wasn't helping. It was just creating a different kind of pain. "All right," he said finally. "We can try. But Helena, we have to be careful. Thomas can never know about our feelings. It would destroy him." "I know," Helena said. "And he won't. I'll make sure of it." From that day forward, things slowly began to improve. Preston and Helena developed a careful friendship, one that allowed them to interact without the constant tension and avoidance. They talked about the ranch, about Peter, about books and ideas and the future. Preston let himself become more involved in Peter's life, playing with the boy and helping Helena care for him when Thomas was busy. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But it was something. A small space where Preston could be near Helena without feeling like he was betraying his brother with every breath. He told himself it was a sustainable arrangement, that he could live like this indefinitely. And then, 2 years after Helena had arrived in Hecla, Thomas fell ill. It started as a cough, something minor that no one worried about. But it got worse, settling deep in Thomas's chest. The doctor was summoned and diagnosed pneumonia, the same illness that had nearly killed their foreman Jake years earlier. But where Jake had recovered, Thomas only got sicker. Preston and Helena took turns sitting with him as the fever raged. Thomas was delirious most of the time, occasionally lucid enough to recognize them. During one of those lucid moments, Thomas grabbed Preston's hand with surprising strength. "Promise me something," Thomas whispered. "Anything," Preston said, his heart breaking at how weak his brother sounded. "If I don't make it through this, promise me you'll take care of Helena and Peter. Don't let them want for anything. Be the man I know you are." "You're going to be fine," Preston said, but the words felt hollow. "Promise me," Thomas insisted. "I promise," Preston said. "But you're going to pull through this. You have to. Helena and Peter need you." Thomas's smile was sad. "They need you too, brother, more than you know." Those were the last coherent words Thomas spoke. He slipped into unconsciousness that evening and never woke up. He died 3 days later, with Preston holding one hand and Helena holding the other. He was 25 years old. The funeral was held on a gray, drizzly day that felt appropriate for the loss. It seemed like the whole town turned out, along with all the ranch hands and neighboring ranchers. Thomas had been well liked, and his death hit the community hard. Preston stood beside Helena during the service, with Peter, now a year and a half old, balanced on his hip. The little boy didn't understand what was happening, but he seemed to sense the sadness, staying unusually quiet. Helena was composed throughout, her face pale but dry. Preston knew she was holding herself together through sheer force of will, and he wanted desperately to comfort her but didn't know how. After the funeral, there was the practical business of settling Thomas's affairs. To Preston's surprise, Thomas had left a will, drawn up shortly after Peter was born. It left everything to Helena, with the provision that Preston would help run the ranch and care for the family. It was exactly what Preston had promised to do, but seeing it in legal writing somehow made it more real, more permanent. Helena threw herself into grief and into caring for Peter. Preston threw himself into running the ranch. They moved through the days mechanically, doing what needed to be done, supporting each other but maintaining a careful emotional distance. It was as if they both knew that if they let themselves truly lean on each other, they might collapse entirely. It was 3 months after Thomas's death when Helena finally broke down. Preston found her in the barn one evening, sitting in an empty stall and crying as if her heart was breaking. Peter was with Mrs. Henley in town, giving Helena some rare time alone. Preston should have left her to her grief. Should have respected her privacy. Instead, he sat down beside her and pulled her into his arms, and Helena sobbed against his chest like she'd been holding it in for years. "I feel so guilty," she choked out between sobs. "Thomas is dead, and part of me is relieved because now I don't have to pretend anymore. What kind of monster does that make me?" "It doesn't make you a monster," Preston said, stroking her hair. "It makes you human. You were in an impossible situation, and you did the best you could. Thomas never knew. He died happy, believing you loved him." "But I didn't," Helena said. "Not the way he deserved. I cared for him, I respected him, but I never loved him, not like I love you." Preston's arms tightened around her. "Don't, Helena, don't say that." "Why not? He's gone, Preston." "I'll mourn him. I'll always be grateful for what he gave me, but I can't lie anymore. I'm in love with you. I've always been in love with you, and now there's nothing stopping us except our own guilt." Preston wanted to deny it, wanted to push her away and maintain the careful distance they'd built. But Thomas was dead, and Helena was in his arms, and Preston was so tired of fighting what he felt. "It's too soon," he said instead. "People would talk. They'd say terrible things about you, about us. We have to wait, have to be respectful of Thomas's memory." "How long?" Helena asked, pulling back to look at him with red-rimmed eyes. "I don't know," Preston admitted. "A year at least, maybe longer. However long it takes for people to accept it, to understand that this isn't a betrayal of Thomas." Helena laughed bitterly. "But it is a betrayal. We've been betraying him in our hearts since the day we met." "He never knew," Preston said firmly. "That has to count for something. We never acted on it while he was alive. We never dishonored him that way. And we'll continue to honor his memory by doing this right, by waiting until it's appropriate." Helena sagged against him, exhausted. "I'm so tired, Preston. I'm tired of fighting and feeling guilty and pretending. I just want to be with you without all this weight." "Soon," Preston promised, knowing even as he said it that it was a lie. It would never be simple, would never be without weight, but maybe, eventually, it could be bearable. Maybe they could find a way to be together that honored Thomas's memory instead of desecrating it. The year that followed was strange and difficult. Preston and Helena ran the ranch together, falling into a partnership that felt natural and right. They were careful about appearances, maintaining separate bedrooms and being scrupulously proper when anyone else was around. But in private moments, they allowed themselves small intimacies. A touch of hands when passing in the hallway, long conversations after Peter was asleep, stolen moments of closeness that kept them both sane. Peter grew into a bright, energetic toddler who loved both Preston and Helena with equal intensity. He started calling Preston Papa, and while it broke Preston's heart that Peter would never really know his actual father, he couldn't deny the fierce love and protectiveness he felt for the boy. 18 months after Thomas's death, Preston proposed. It was simple and private, just the two of them on the porch after Peter had gone to bed. He didn't have a ring, didn't make a grand gesture. He just took Helena's hand and said, "Marry me. Let's stop pretending and just be a family for real." Helena's eyes filled with tears, but they were happy tears this time. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, Preston, I'll marry you." They were married quietly a month later in the same church where Helena had married Thomas. It felt wrong and right at the same time, a complicated mixture of emotions that Preston suspected would characterize their entire relationship. Some people in town clearly disapproved, thinking it was too soon, that there was something unseemly about Preston marrying his brother's widow. But others were kinder, seeing only two people who'd been through hardship finding comfort in each other. Their wedding night was tender and nervous, both of them overly aware of the years of longing that had led to this moment. But it was also right, finally being able to love each other openly, to express physically what they'd been feeling for so long. "I love you," Helena whispered as they lay together afterward. "I've loved you for so long, Preston. I'm sorry it took us this long to get here." "Don't be sorry," Preston said, pulling her close. "We did the right thing, we honored Thomas, and now we get to start our life together with a clear conscience." "Do we?" Helena asked. "Will we ever really be free of the guilt?" Preston didn't have an answer for that. The truth was, he suspected he'd carry some guilt for the rest of his life, would always wonder if there was something he could have done differently, some way to have prevented all the pain and complication. But he also knew that what he felt for Helena was real and deep and worth fighting for. "We'll figure it out together," he said finally. "That's all we can do." Life on the ranch settled into a new normal. Preston and Helena were partners in every sense of the word, running the operation together and raising Peter as their son. They were careful to keep Thomas's memory alive for the boy, telling him stories about his father, making sure he knew he'd been loved. It was important to both of them that Peter understand his heritage, that he not grow up thinking Preston had simply replaced Thomas. 2 years after their marriage, Helena gave birth to another son. They named him Thomas, after Preston's brother and Helena's first husband. It felt like a way of honoring the man who'd brought them together, a way of acknowledging that their happiness had been built on the foundation of Thomas's kindness and generosity. Little Thomas was followed a year and a half later by a daughter, whom they named Grace. Peter adored his younger siblings, taking his role as big brother seriously. He was 6 now, old enough to help with small chores around the ranch, and he followed Preston everywhere, asking endless questions about cattle and horses and the land. The ranch prospered under Preston and Helena's joint management. They expanded their holdings, bought better breeding stock, weathered droughts and hard winters through careful planning and sheer determination. Preston's reputation as a fair and honest rancher grew, and the Callahan Ranch became known as one of the best operations in Montana Territory. But it wasn't the success of the ranch that mattered most to Preston. It was the quiet moments with Helena, the private smiles they shared, the way she fit perfectly against him when they sat together on the porch in the evenings. It was watching Peter grow into a fine young man, seeing little Thomas toddle after his brother, holding Grace as she fell asleep in his arms. It was the family they'd built together, complicated and imperfect but undeniably real. Sometimes, usually late at night when he couldn't sleep, Preston would think about Thomas. He'd wonder what his brother would think of how things had turned out, whether he'd be angry or understanding. Preston liked to believe Thomas would be happy, would be glad that Helena and Peter were cared for, that the ranch was thriving, that Preston had found love even if it came in a complicated way. He'd never know for certain. All he could do was live his life as honorably as possible, love Helena and the children with everything he had, and hope that wherever Thomas was, he understood. One evening, about 5 years after their marriage, Preston and Helena sat on the porch watching the sun set over the prairie. Peter was teaching Thomas and Grace how to rope a fence post, his young voice carrying clearly through the warm air. Helena was leaning against Preston, her hand in his, and everything felt peaceful and right. "You ever regret it?" Preston asked suddenly. Coming to Montana, marrying into this family, all the complications that followed. Helena was quiet for a moment, considering. "No," she said finally. "It was hard, and there were times I thought I'd made a terrible mistake. But look at what we have now, Preston. We have each other, we have the children, we have this life we've built. How could I regret something that led to this?" "I love you," Preston said, the words coming easily now after years of being able to say them freely. "I've loved you since the moment I saw you step off that stagecoach, and I'll love you until the day I die." Helena turned to smile at him, her green eyes bright with happiness and just a touch of mischief. "I know, and I've loved you just as long, even though I was promised to your brother." "Funny how things work out, isn't it?" "Funny isn't the word I'd use," Preston said, but he was smiling too. "Complicated, difficult, sometimes painful, but worth it. Always worth it." They sat in comfortable silence, watching their children play, and the sky turn from gold to pink to purple. The prairie stretched out around them, vast and beautiful and full of possibility. Preston thought about the years ahead, about watching the children grow, about growing old with Helena by his side. It wouldn't always be easy. Life never was. But it would be theirs, built on a foundation of love and respect and the determination to honor the past while embracing the future. In the distance, Peter whooped as he successfully roped the fence post, and Thomas and Grace clapped excitedly. Helena laughed, the sound warm and free, and Preston felt his heart swell with contentment. This was his life now. This was his family. And despite everything they'd gone through to get here, despite the guilt and the pain and the complicated beginning, he wouldn't change a single moment of it. The years continued to pass with the steady rhythm of ranch life. Peter grew tall and strong, learning everything Preston could teach him about running cattle and managing land. At 16, he was already as capable as men twice his age, with his father Thomas's easy smile and his uncle-turned-stepfather Preston's steady temperament. He knew the story of his birth, knew that Preston wasn't his biological father, but he'd never made any distinction between how he treated Preston versus his younger siblings. To Peter, family was family, and that was all that mattered. Thomas, named for his uncle, grew into a thoughtful boy who loved books as much as ranching. He was 12 now, often found reading in the barn or asking Helena endless questions about the world beyond Montana. Helena encouraged his curiosity, ordering books from back east and teaching him everything she remembered from her own education. Grace, at 10 years old, was fearless and wild, more comfortable on a horse than anywhere else. She declared her intention to be a rancher just like her father, and neither Preston nor Helena had the heart to tell her that the world might not be ready for a female ranch owner. If anyone could change people's minds through sheer force of personality, it would be Grace. As Montana transitioned from territory to state in 1889, the Callahan Ranch was firmly established as one of the most successful operations in the region. Preston had proven himself not just as a rancher, but as a leader in the community, helping negotiate better prices for cattle, organizing cooperative efforts among neighboring ranches, and standing up for fair treatment of the men who worked the land. Helena had found her own place in the community, not just as Preston's wife, but as a skilled healer and midwife. The medical knowledge her father had taught her, combined with years of practical experience on a working ranch, made her invaluable when someone was sick or injured. She'd helped birth half the babies in Hecla over the past decade, and saved more than a few lives with her skill and steady hands. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Preston surprised Helena with a trip to Helena, the city in Montana that shared her name. It was the first time they'd been away from the ranch together since their marriage, and despite Helena's initial protests about leaving the children, Preston insisted. "Peter can handle things for a few days," he said firmly, and Mrs. Henley agreed to stay at the ranch with the younger ones. "You've worked yourself to the bone for 10 years, Helena. You deserve a break." The trip was like a second honeymoon. They stayed in a real hotel, ate in restaurants, attended a theater performance. Helena bought fabric for new dresses and books for the children. Preston bought her a beautiful necklace with a green stone that matched her eyes. They talked for hours about everything and nothing, reminding each other of who they were beyond ranchers and parents. On their last night before heading home, they were walking back to the hotel through the quiet streets when Helena stopped suddenly and turned to face Preston. "Thank you," she said simply. "For what?" Preston asked, genuinely confused. "For this trip, for the life we've built, for being patient all those years ago when you could have just taken what you wanted, for being the man you are." Helena's eyes were bright with emotion. "I know it hasn't always been easy, Preston. I know there's still guilt sometimes, still moments when you wonder if we did the right thing. But I need you to know that I've never regretted choosing you. Even if I was technically promised to Thomas first, even if our beginning was complicated, you are the love of my life. You always have been." Preston pulled her close, not caring who might see them on the street. "You're my love too, Helena. My heart, my partner, my best friend. These have been the happiest years of my life, and I wouldn't trade a single day of them." They stood there for a long moment, holding each other under the Montana stars, two people who'd found their way to happiness despite every obstacle in their path. When they returned to the ranch, they found everything running smoothly under Peter's careful management. The boy had his father's knack for organization and Preston's work ethic, a combination that promised great things for his future. Preston felt a surge of pride watching Peter handle the ranch hands with quiet authority, settling disputes, and making decisions with confidence beyond his years. Life continued its steady march forward. There were droughts and good years, cattle that thrived and cattle that didn't, hired hands who became like family and others who moved on. Jake, their old foreman, finally retired and moved to town, but he came by regularly to offer advice and tell stories about the old days. Mrs. Henley passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 73, and the whole town mourned the loss of the woman who'd welcomed so many strangers and made them feel at home. Peter met a young woman named Sarah Winters at a church social when he was 19. She was the daughter of a neighboring rancher, smart and capable and every bit as determined as Peter. They courted for a year before Peter asked Preston's permission to marry her. Preston gave it gladly, seeing in Peter and Sarah the same kind of partnership he shared with Helena. The wedding was a joyous occasion, held at the ranch with half of Montana territory in attendance. Preston stood up with Peter, now a full-grown man who stood eye to eye with him, and felt his heart swell with pride and a bittersweet kind of sadness. Thomas should have been here to see his son marry, should have been able to walk Peter down the aisle or give the kind of fatherly advice that Preston never felt quite qualified to give. As if reading his thoughts, Helena squeezed Preston's hand during the ceremony. When he looked at her, she mouthed, "He knows. He's here." And Preston chose to believe it, chose to believe that somewhere, somehow, Thomas was watching over the son he'd never really gotten to know and was proud of the man Peter had become. Peter and Sarah moved into a house on the far edge of the ranch property, close enough to help with operations but far enough to have their own space. Within a year, they had a daughter of their own, whom they named Helena after her grandmother. The first time Preston held his granddaughter, he felt like he'd come full circle. This tiny baby, with her shock of dark hair and serious eyes, represented everything good that had come from that fateful day when Helena stepped off the stagecoach in Hecla. More grandchildren followed as the years rolled on. Young Thomas married a schoolteacher from town and gave Helena and Preston 2 grandsons. Grace, true to her word, took over more and more of the ranch operations, earning the respect of the men through sheer competence and refusing every marriage proposal that came her way until she was 32, and met a quiet rancher from Wyoming who loved her fierce independence instead of trying to tame it. Preston and Helena grew older together, their hair turning gray, their faces weathering with age and sun and hard work. But their love only deepened, becoming something richer and more complex than the desperate attraction of their early years. They knew each other completely, could communicate with a glance, could finish each other's sentences. They'd weathered storms and droughts, loss and triumph, and had come through it all stronger. On Preston's 60th birthday, the whole family gathered at the ranch for a celebration. The house and grounds were filled with children and grandchildren, with friends and neighbors, with hired hands past and present. It was chaos and noise and laughter, and Preston loved every moment of it. That evening, after everyone had left or gone to bed, Preston and Helena sat on the porch swing they'd installed years ago. It was the same porch where Preston had proposed, where they'd watched countless sunsets, where they'd built a lifetime of memories. "We did all right, didn't we?" Helena asked, her head resting on Preston's shoulder. "Better than all right," Preston said, putting his arm around her. "We did pretty damn good if you ask me." "Thomas would be proud," Helena said softly, "of Peter, of the ranch, of everything we've built." "I think he would," Preston agreed. "I hope he would." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars come out one by one. Preston thought about that day so many years ago when a stagecoach arrived early and changed his life forever. He thought about the young woman who'd stepped down onto the dusty street, promised to his brother but destined for him. He thought about all the pain and guilt and complicated emotions that had followed, and about the joy and love and family that had emerged from it all. No regrets. He asked Helena the same question he'd asked years before. "No regrets," Helena confirmed. "It was hard and it was complicated and sometimes it hurt, but Preston, you were always the one I was meant to find." Even if I was promised to Thomas, even if fate seemed determined to keep us apart, we found our way to each other, and that makes every struggle worth it. Preston kissed the top of her head, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair. "I love you, Helena Callahan." from that first moment to this one and every moment in between. "I love you too," Helena said. "Always have, always will." They rocked gently on the swing, two people who'd fought for their love and one who'd built something beautiful out of impossible circumstances. The prairie night was warm and peaceful, full of the sounds of cattle and crickets and the distant call of an owl. Inside the house, their children and grandchildren slept, safe and loved. The ranch they'd built together would carry on, passing to the next generation and the one after that. Preston felt a deep sense of contentment settle over him. This was his legacy, not just the land and cattle, but the family he'd helped create, the love he'd shared with Helena, the life they'd built together despite every obstacle. He'd made mistakes, had carried guilt for years, but in the end, he'd lived according to his own sense of honor and had been rewarded with more happiness than he'd ever thought possible. As the years continued to pass, Preston and Helena slowed down but never stopped working. They were fixtures on the ranch, sources of wisdom and experience that the younger generations relied on. Preston taught his grandsons to ride and rope, passed on the knowledge of cattle and land that he'd accumulated over a lifetime. Helena continued to serve as the ranch's healer, though she trained Peter's daughter, young Helena, to take over more of those duties. On a warm spring day, when Preston was 68 and Helena 65, they took a rare afternoon to themselves and rode out to a spot on the ranch they'd always loved. It was a small rise that overlooked a creek, with views that stretched for miles in every direction. They'd come here often in the early years of their marriage, when they needed to escape the demands of ranch life and just be together. They spread a blanket under a cottonwood tree and sat close, watching the cattle graze in the distance and the clouds drift overhead. Preston thought about all the years they'd shared, all the moments both ordinary and extraordinary that had made up their life together. "I want you to know something," Preston said suddenly. "When I die, and it could be tomorrow or 20 years from now, I want you to know that you made my life worth living. Everything good that I am, everything we've built, it's because you stepped off that stagecoach all those years ago." "Don't talk about dying," Helena said, but her voice was gentle rather than scolding. "We have years left yet." "Maybe," Preston said, "but I want to say it anyway. I want you to know that loving you was the best thing I ever did. Even with all the complications, even with the guilt and the waiting and the difficulty, it was worth it. You were worth it." Helena turned to look at him, her green eyes still as bright and intelligent as they'd been the day he met her. "You were worth waiting for too," she said. "You were worth all of it, Preston. Every hard moment, every sacrifice, every tear, because in the end we got this. We got us." They kissed softly and sweetly, two people who'd loved each other across decades and through every kind of hardship. When they pulled apart, Helena was smiling. "Remember that first day?" she asked. "When you met me at the stagecoach and I thought you were Thomas. I remember thinking you were the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen," Preston said. "And then realizing you were promised to my brother and feeling like fate was playing the cruelest joke imaginable." "But it wasn't cruel in the end," Helena said. "It was just complicated. We had to wait, had to earn our happiness, but we got there eventually." "We did," Preston agreed. "And it was worth the wait." They stayed on the hill until the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink and gold. Then they rode slowly back to the ranch, to the house full of family, to the life they'd built together stone by stone and day by day. Preston lived to the age of 73, long enough to see all his grandchildren grown and several great-grandchildren born. He died peacefully in his sleep, with Helena beside him, just as he'd hoped. His funeral was one of the largest Hecla had ever seen, with people coming from across Montana, and beyond to pay their respects to a man who'd been respected and loved throughout the territory. Helena lived another 5 years after Preston's death, strong and sharp-minded until the very end. She spent her days surrounded by family, sharing stories about Preston and Thomas, about the early days of the ranch, about the wild territory that Montana had once been. She never remarried, never even considered it. Preston had been her great love, the man she'd waited years to be with, and no one could replace him. When Helena died at 78, she was buried next to Preston on the hill they'd loved, overlooking the ranch they'd built together. And beside them, in a spot that had been kept empty all those years, was Thomas's grave, moved from the town cemetery so the three of them could rest together. Peter saw to it personally, understanding in a way his younger siblings didn't quite grasp that all three of them, Helena, Preston, and Thomas, were part of the same story. They'd been bound together by love and loyalty, by promises and sacrifice, and even death wouldn't separate them. The Callahan Ranch continued to thrive under Peter's management, and later under his children's and grandchildren's. The story of Helena and Preston became family legend, told and retold at gatherings, a reminder of the complicated but beautiful way that love sometimes finds us. New generations of Callahans were born, lived, loved, and died on that Montana land. But they never forgot the couple who'd built it all, who'd overcome impossible odds to be together. And on quiet evenings, when the wind blew just right across the prairie, some swore they could see two figures sitting on the porch of the old ranch house, holding hands and watching the sunset together, finally at peace with the choices they'd made and the life they'd shared. Whether it was real or just wishful thinking didn't matter. What mattered was that Preston and Helena's love had become part of the land itself, woven into the fabric of the ranch and the family that carried on their legacy. They'd started with a chance meeting at a stagecoach, a mail-order bride promised to one brother but destined for another. They'd navigated guilt and longing, duty and desire, always trying to do what was right even when their hearts pulled them in different directions. And in the end, they'd proven that true love, the kind that's willing to wait and sacrifice and honor the people it might hurt, was worth fighting for. Their story was uniquely theirs, but the lessons it taught carried on through generations. Love isn't always simple. Sometimes the right person comes at the wrong time, or in the wrong circumstances. But if that love is real, if it's built on respect and patience and genuine caring, it can overcome any obstacle. It might take time, might require sacrifice, might demand more strength than seems possible. But it will endure. That was Preston and Helena's gift to their family, to the ranch, to the generations that came after. Not just the land or the cattle or the successful operation, but the proof that love, real and true and hard-won, could conquer anything. And that was a legacy worth more than all the gold in Montana.